My life felt like a dream come true, one of those dreams you are afraid to wake up from, because reality could never measure up to such perfection. I was about to marry Julian, the man I had envisioned for years as the father of my children, my life partner, my safest haven in this chaotic world. Everything was prepared with meticulous care and endless attention to detail. The flowers were hand-picked white roses and baby's breath, arranged in cascades that would make even the most discerning florist weep. The menu was curated by a chef who had worked in Michelin-starred restaurants. The music was performed by a string quartet that had played at Carnegie Hall. Even the smallest details that only we would notice were perfect. The way the napkins were folded in the exact pattern my grandmother had taught me, the subtle lavender scent wafting through the reception hall that reminded Julian of his childhood summers in Provence. Mother cried tears of pure joy as I looked at myself in the antique full-length mirror, dressed in my flowing white gown that had taken 8 months to design and create. The silk was imported from Italy, the lace hand-sewn by artisans in France, and the pearls were my great-grandmother's. As I stood there, I thought I had finally found true happiness, the kind of happiness that poets write about and dreamers chase their entire lives. What I didn't know was that this wedding, which was supposed to seal a love story for the ages, would actually mark the beginning of my greatest tragedy, and ultimately, my most powerful transformation. From the very beginning of our relationship, I knew I couldn't walk down the aisle without my best friend, Laura Jenkins, by my side. She was more than just a friend to me. She was my soul sister, my confidante, the only person who knew every corner of my heart, every secret fear, every impossible dream. We had met in college during our freshman orientation, two scared girls from small towns thrown into the intimidating world of university life. We had bonded over late-night study sessions, shared heartbreaks, celebrated each other's victories, and supported each other through family tragedies. That is why I chose her as my maid of honor without a second thought, without even considering anyone else for the role. No one questioned my decision because everyone who knew us understood how deep our connection was, how we seemed to share thoughts and finish each other's sentences. She smiled with what appeared to be genuine tenderness as she helped me with my veil, making sure every detail was absolutely perfect. Her fingers were gentle as she arranged the delicate lace around my shoulders, and her eyes seemed to sparkle with happiness for me. "You look absolutely radiant," she whispered, her voice thick with what I interpreted as emotion. "Julian is the luckiest man in the world." I remember feeling so grateful in that moment, so blessed to have someone who cared about my happiness as much as she appeared to. What I didn't know was that behind her sweet, loving eyes, a dark secret was hiding. A secret that would destroy my life from the inside out and shatter everything I believed about trust, loyalty and love. We wanted an intimate wedding, far from the hustle and bustle of city life, where we could focus on what truly mattered: our love and the beginning of our new life together. That is why we chose an elegant estate in the rolling hills of Virginia, surrounded by century-old oak trees and blooming gardens that looked like something from a fairy tale. The place was magical, with a stately stone manor that had housed generations of families, cozy rooms filled with antiques and family portraits, and a grand hall with soaring ceilings and enormous windows that let in the warm golden light of the setting sun. There, surrounded by our families and closest friends, we dreamed of celebrating our love and starting a new chapter that would be filled with joy, laughter and shared adventures. Nothing seemed out of place that day. Everything felt harmonious, like the universe had aligned to give us this perfect moment. But that same place that was supposed to witness the most beautiful beginning of my existence would soon become the stage for the most painful collapse of everything I held dear. We had rented the entire estate for the long weekend, so that our parents and the wedding party could stay the night before and after the wedding. We wanted it to be more than just a single event. We wanted it to be a celebration of togetherness, a time for shared laughter, storytelling, and joyful anticipation of what was to come. We envisioned cozy mornings with coffee on the terrace, evening walks through the gardens, and meaningful conversations that would deepen our bonds with the people we loved most. The night before the wedding, we all had dinner together on the stone patio, which was illuminated by thousands of twinkling string lights that made everything look like a scene from a romantic movie. Soft classical music played in the background, glasses of wine were raised in countless toasts, and the air was filled with laughter and warmth. Julian seemed calm, and even more affectionate than usual, taking every opportunity to hold my hand, kiss my forehead, and whisper sweet words in my ear. Laura never left my side throughout the evening, just as she always had during important moments in my life, making sure I was comfortable, bringing me water when I got too excited to remember to drink, and sharing inside jokes that made me laugh until my cheeks hurt. No one suspected that beneath all that apparent calm and joy, a storm was brewing that would change our lives forever, leaving destruction in its wake. That night, I went to bed with a heart overflowing with hope, mentally replaying every beautiful moment of the day, and picturing the even more magical moments that awaited me tomorrow. I fell asleep late, feeling a mixture of nervousness and pure happiness, imagining the moment when I would walk toward Julian in my white dress, when we would exchange vows that would bind our souls together for eternity, when we would finally become husband and wife in the eyes of God and everyone we loved. I could almost feel his hand in mine, as we would dance our first dance as a married couple, could almost taste the champagne we would share as we cut our cake, could almost hear the laughter and applause that would surround us as we began our journey as one. I slept peacefully that night, completely unaware that my dreams of happiness were about to become the most devastating nightmare imaginable. The next morning, the first rays of September sunshine streamed through the tall windows of my bridal suite, and I woke up with an energy and excitement I hadn't felt since I was a little girl on Christmas morning. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of roses from the garden below, and everything seemed to shimmer with possibility. Laura was the first one to enter my room, bringing me breakfast on a silver tray with a smile that I now remember as perfectly crafted but completely hollow. She had prepared fresh berries, croissants from the local French bakery, and coffee made exactly the way I liked it, face strong and black, with just a touch of vanilla. "Today is your day, beautiful," she said, setting the tray down on the antique writing desk by the window. "How are you feeling?" I felt grateful beyond measure, excited beyond words, and completely secure in the knowledge that I was about to marry my soulmate. "I feel like the luckiest woman alive," I told her honestly, not knowing that luck was about to abandon me entirely. The morning passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. My hair was styled by a professional who had driven in from the city, arranged in an elegant updo that showcased the diamond earrings Julian had given me as a wedding gift. My makeup was applied with an artist's precision, creating a look that was both timeless and radiant. My dress fit like it had been made by angels, hugging every curve perfectly while flowing like water around my legs. Laura helped me with every detail, from fastening the hundreds of tiny pearl buttons that ran up the back of my dress to arranging my train so it would cascade perfectly down the stairs. She seemed just as excited as I was, taking photos of every moment, helping me practice my walk and reminding me to breathe when I got overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. When it was time, my father took my arm with tears already glistening in his eyes, and we began our walk toward the garden, where everyone was waiting for us. The sound of the string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon filled the air, mixing with the soft rustle of white rose petals scattered along the stone pathway. The gentle sounds of nature, fay birds singing in the ancient trees, a soft breeze rustling through the leaves, created the perfect symphony for this most important moment of my life. Everything looked like it had been pulled from the pages of a storybook. The white wooden chairs were arranged in perfect rows, decorated with flowing white ribbon and cascading flowers. The archway where Julian was waiting was covered in climbing roses and ivy, creating a frame that looked like it belonged in a painting. Julian stood at the end of the aisle, with tears glistening in his eyes, and that smile that had made me fall in love with him so many times over the years. He looked impossibly handsome in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his dark hair combed back, his eyes locked on mine with what appeared to be pure adoration. I walked toward him with my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it, holding back tears of overwhelming joy, convinced that I was taking the most important and beautiful step of my entire life. No one in that perfect garden setting could have predicted that my heartfelt I do would actually be the beginning of my greatest heartbreak, the moment when everything I believed about love, trust, and forever would come crashing down around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. When the officiant asked if we promised to join our lives together in sickness and health, for richer and poorer, for better and worse, I didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second. My voice was shaky with emotion, but absolutely firm in its conviction as I said, "I do." My eyes filled with love and complete trust as I looked at Julian. He also said, "I do," with what appeared to be a smile of pure joy. Though for just a moment I thought I detected something else in his expression, a flicker of something darker that passed so quickly I convinced myself it was just nerves. After all, we were both feeling the overwhelming weight of the commitment we were making, the magnitude of promising to love each other until death do us part. We kissed to the sound of thunderous applause, surrounded by white rose petals that seemed to fall from heaven itself, and tears of joy from everyone we loved most in the world. In that instant, I believed with every fiber of my being that it was all worth it, that our love was real, strong, and destined to last forever. The celebration was exactly as we had imagined, intimate, elegant, and filled with pure joy. We danced under a canopy of stars that seemed to have been placed specifically for us, with soft music playing in the background and candles flickering at every table like tiny beacons of hope and love. There were moments of laughter that made my cheeks hurt from smiling so much, heartfelt speeches that brought tears to my eyes, and warm embraces from family members who told me they had never seen me look so happy. My father stood up, visibly emotional, to toast our union with words that spoke of how proud he was of the woman I had become, and how he had watched our love grow from its earliest stages. "I have never seen two people more perfect for each other," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "May your love continue to grow stronger with each passing day." Everyone applauded and raised their glasses, and Julian lifted his champagne flute with a smile that seemed genuine, but somehow didn't quite reach his eyes the way it used to. I was so caught up in the magic of the evening that I attributed any strange vibes to wedding day stress and the overwhelming nature of such a significant life change. I looked at him throughout the evening, trying to capture every detail of his face, every expression, every gesture, so I could remember this perfect day forever. He talked to our guests and laughed at their jokes, but there was something distant in the way he looked at me now, something that felt different from the warm, adoring gazes he used to give me. When he thought I wasn't looking, his expression would sometimes go blank, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. I didn't want to think too much about it because this was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. I decided to ignore the small voice in the back of my mind that whispered something was wrong, and instead focus on enjoying every second of what I believed was the beginning of our fairy tale life together. After the party wound down and the last of our guests had either retired to their rooms or departed for their homes, we went up to the bridal suite together. It was a warm and elegant space that we had specially decorated with fresh white roses and vanilla candles to make this night as romantic and unforgettable as possible. My heart was pounding with a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and pure love as I thought about how special this night would be, our first night as husband and wife, the moment when we would finally truly become one. I closed the heavy wooden door softly behind us, wanting to savor this intimate moment and make it last forever, believing we were about to seal our love story with the most beautiful chapter yet. Julian placed his gold watch on the antique nightstand, with mechanical precision, removed his black leather shoes without looking at me, and let out a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. The sound cut through the romantic atmosphere like a knife through silk. I moved toward him with my arms open, ready to embrace my new husband, and begin this beautiful new chapter of our lives together. That is when I heard words that would haunt me for years to come. "I am tired," he said, not looking at me, his tone as dry and flat, as if I were nothing more than a stranger asking for directions, as if the woman standing before him in the beautiful white dress wasn't his bride, wasn't the person he had just promised to love and cherish for the rest of his life. I stood frozen in place, trying to process what I had just heard, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke, or if something had happened during the reception that I had somehow missed. His face was serious, distant, and completely devoid of the emotion or desire that should have filled this most intimate of moments. Without another word, without even glancing in my direction, he turned his back to me, unbuttoned his crisp white shirt with movements that seemed almost robotic, and walked directly to the small single bed that had been placed in the corner of the room for extra seating. He didn't say goodnight. He didn't turn around to look at me one more time. He didn't offer any explanation for his bizarre behavior. He simply turned off the bedside lamp with a click that sounded like a door slamming shut, leaving the room in a darkness that seemed to mirror the sudden darkness that had fallen over my heart. I sat on the edge of what was supposed to be our marriage bed, not knowing what to do with my body, my thoughts, or the crushing weight of confusion and hurt that was settling over me like a suffocating blanket. I felt invisible on what should have been the most important night of my life, like I had somehow become a ghost in my own love story. I waited for what felt like endless hours for some kind of gesture, a word of explanation, an apology, anything that would make sense of what was happening, but all I received was the sound of his quiet, steady breathing from across the room, as calm and untroubled as if nothing at all was wrong. I slowly lay down on the cold, empty bed, unable to hold back the tears that began to flow silently down my cheeks, trying desperately not to make a sound so I wouldn't seem pathetic or needy. The room still smelled of the fresh roses we had placed everywhere, but inside my chest everything beautiful was beginning to wither and die, and that is how I spent my first night as a wife, Faye, alone, confused, heartbroken, and with a soul that felt like it was slowly cracking into a million pieces. I don't know how long I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, wishing desperately that this was all some terrible nightmare that I would wake up from to find Julian holding me close and whispering apologies for the bad dream I had imagined. I wished that he would suddenly realize his mistake and come to me with explanations and declarations of love, but the hours passed with absolute silence, and his body remained perfectly still in that single bed, as far from me as if we were strangers who had accidentally been placed in the same room. At some point, pure exhaustion must have overtaken my racing mind, and I fell into a restless sleep filled with confused dreams and half-formed fears. But I couldn't have been asleep for more than 30 minutes, when a muffled sound jolted me awake with my heart racing, like I had just run a marathon. I sat up quickly, disoriented and confused, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, and what could possibly be happening at this hour of the night. I turned my head toward Julian's bed, and my stomach dropped. Faye, it was empty. The blankets were thrown back carelessly, and there was no sign of my husband anywhere in the room. I slowly got up from the bed, my bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor, feeling a knot of dread growing in my stomach that I couldn't explain or rationalize away. I walked cautiously to the heavy wooden door, opened it as quietly as possible, and immediately heard the sound again. It was a short muffled groan, as if someone was trying very hard not to make noise but couldn't completely control themselves. The sound sent chills down my spine and made every instinct in my body scream that something was very, very wrong. The hallway was dark except for a thin stream of light coming from a room at the far end, and I felt my heart begin to pound so hard. I was sure it could be heard throughout the entire house. I stood there for several long seconds, trying to convince myself that maybe it was just someone watching television, or perhaps someone had fallen ill and needed help. Anything logical and innocent that would explain what I was hearing, but something deep inside me, some primitive instinct that women have developed over centuries of learning to recognize danger, already knew that I was about to discover something that would change my life forever. I forced myself to move forward, still making no sound, my silk nightgown whispering against my legs as I crept down the hallway like a thief in my own wedding venue, and that is when I remembered that the room the light was coming from belonged to my mother-in-law, Julian's mother, Margaret. She had mentioned at the end of the reception dinner that she was feeling unwell and needed to drive into town to get some medicine from the late-night pharmacy. She had left in her car around 10 o'clock and hadn't returned since, and no one seemed to have worried about her absence or thought to check on her. Mine began to piece together fragments of a puzzle I didn't want to solve, but my heart refused to believe what my logical mind was starting to suspect. What could Julian possibly be doing in his mother's room in the middle of the night, in a room that was supposed to be empty, on our wedding night of all nights? I took another step forward, and the sounds continued. Soft groans mixed with what sounded like whispered conversations and muffled laughter that I couldn't quite make out, but that filled me with a sense of dread so profound it made me feel physically sick. I moved down the hallway with a heart that felt like it might explode and cold sweat running down my back despite the warm September night, trying to silence every step so I wouldn't alert whoever was inside that room to my presence. It wasn't just the mysterious noise that was bothering me anymore, Faye. It was the fact that Julian had abandoned me on our wedding night, left me alone and confused without a word of explanation, to do something secretive in a room that should have been empty. And in that moment, walking down that dark hallway, something inside me started connecting dots that I had been ignoring for weeks. Maybe months, little details that hadn't seemed important before but now felt like pieces of a horrifying puzzle finally coming together. I stopped right in front of the door that belonged to my mother-in-law. The same door that was supposed to be protecting an empty room that night, and I felt my hands shaking uncontrollably from inside. The sounds continued softer now, as if whoever was in there had become more careful about the noise they were making, as if they somehow sensed that someone might be listening. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing heart, and put my ear gently against the cold wood of the door, holding my breath so I could hear more clearly. The sound of bed springs creaking softly, a barely audible sigh, and then a woman's voice speaking in hushed tones. I closed my eyes tightly, praying desperately that I was wrong about what I was hearing, but I recognized that voice instantly. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind, even though I wished more than anything that I could be mistaken. It was Laura's voice, my best friend, my maid of honor, the person I trusted more than anyone else in the world. Her voice was unmistakable, even whispered and breathless as it was. I felt like someone had physically struck me, like the ground had disappeared from beneath my feet without warning. Everything we had shared, all our secrets and dreams, all the late-night conversations about love and loyalty, all the promises of friendship that would last forever, all came crashing down around me with the sound of her voice coming from that room. But the worst was yet to come, and I knew it even as I stood there trying to process what I had already heard. And then I heard his voice, Julian's deep, unmistakable voice, whispering Laura's name between low gasps of pleasure that left absolutely no room for doubt about what was happening on the other side of that door. I felt the ground disappear completely from under my feet. Felt the air grow thick and impossible to breathe. Felt like I was drowning in my own wedding dress while standing perfectly still in a hallway that suddenly felt like it was closing in around me. It was the voice of my husband, the man who just hours ago had promised me eternal love in front of everyone we cared about, the man who had looked into my eyes and vowed to forsake all others, as long as we both lived. And now he was there. In the middle of our wedding night, sharing the bed he had refused to share with me with my best friend, the woman who had helped me get dressed, who had arranged my veil, who had smiled and cried tears of what I thought was joy for my happiness. The tears came without my being able to stop them, but I didn't make a single sound. I rested my forehead against the cold wall, shaking uncontrollably, feeling smaller and more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. I found it almost impossible to understand how this could be happening on my wedding night, in the place where I believed everything beautiful was just beginning. Every word they spoke, every sound they made was like a dagger being twisted in my heart, and still, I couldn't bring myself to move. Part of me wanted to burst through that door and confront them both, to scream and demand explanations, and fight for my marriage. But a larger part of me was too shocked, too devastated, too completely broken to do anything but stand there and let the reality of their betrayal wash over me like a tsunami of pain. I decided to stay there, planted in front of that door like a sentinel, without making a sound, waiting for them to finish their betrayal and come out so I could face them and demand answers. I needed to see their faces when they realized they had been caught, needed to hear their excuses and watch them try to explain the unexplainable. I needed to confirm with my own eyes what I had already heard with my own ears. Even though every second of waiting was torture beyond description, time became eternal in that hallway, every minute feeling like an hour, and my heart continued to beat against my chest with such force that I was amazed it didn't wake the entire house. I closed my eyes, opened them again, and I was still there in my white silk nightgown, still listening to the sounds of my life being destroyed from the other side of a door. I didn't leave, didn't run away, didn't collapse on the floor even though my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of torture, the door opened suddenly and without warning. Julian emerged first, his shirt completely unbuttoned and hanging open, his belt askew, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that I had once found endearing, but now seemed like evidence of his guilt. When he saw me standing there directly in front of him, he froze for a moment that seemed to last forever, his eyes going wide with shock and something that might have been fear. The guilt was written all over his face as clearly as if someone had tattooed the word betrayer on his forehead. He didn't say anything at first, didn't try to explain or lie, or even acknowledge what had just happened. He just stood there, looking at me like he had seen a ghost, turning his head slightly as if he could somehow find an explanation for his actions written on the wall behind him. And then she appeared in the doorway behind him. Laura came out slowly. Her hair completely disheveled and tangled, her makeup smeared across her face in ways that told the whole story without words, her dress wrinkled beyond repair, and her high heels in her hand as if she had been planning to sneak away quietly before I discovered them. When she saw me standing there in front of her, she froze completely, rooted to the spot as if she had been turned to stone, unable to pretend innocence, unable to run, unable to meet my eyes or even look in my direction. She knew she had been caught red-handed, and there was no explanation in the world that could make this right. I didn't need any more proof than what I was seeing with my own eyes. The image of the two of them standing there together, disheveled and guilty, their hair messed and their clothes in disarray, spoke louder and more clearly than 1,000 words could have. And still, despite all the evidence standing right in front of me, despite the sounds I had heard and the state they were both in, I found myself asking the question that I knew would destroy me completely. Why? I stood in front of them without moving an inch, blocking their path back to their rooms, my body tense with a mixture of rage and devastating heartbreak, my voice broken by the weight of anger and pain that threatened to crush me completely. I asked them how they could have done this to me, how they could have had the cold-bloodedness and cruelty to betray me on my wedding night, how they could have destroyed everything I believed in about love and friendship and loyalty in the span of a few hours. Julian looked like a man who had been caught stealing and couldn't figure out where to hide the evidence. He stared at the floor, at the walls, at anything except my face, clearly searching for words that didn't exist. Laura didn't even try to look surprised or innocent. She just stood there with her head down like a child who had been caught doing something she knew was wrong, waiting for the punishment she knew she deserved. Their silence was their first response, as if they expected me to just walk away without demanding answers, as if they thought they could wait me out and I would eventually give up and leave them alone. But I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't going to make this easy for them. I wasn't going to give them a convenient escape from the consequences of their actions. Finally, Julian found his voice, though it came out nervous and shaky as he tried to construct a lie so absurd it was almost insulting to my intelligence. He told me I was wrong, that nothing had happened, that he had only been helping Laura find some things that his mother had left in the room before she went into town. His lie was so clumsy, so obviously false, so desperately improvised that for a moment the sheer audacity of it hurt even more than the betrayal itself. Did he really think I was stupid enough to believe such a ridiculous story? Laura remained completely silent during his pathetic attempt to lie his way out of what I had witnessed. She didn't nod in agreement with his story, didn't try to support his explanation, didn't even look up from the floor. She just stood there while he invented excuses that grew more fragile and more insulting with every word that came out of his mouth. He looked at me as if I were the one who was being unreasonable, as if I were the one who was losing control and making a scene over nothing. But there was no room left in my heart for his theatrical performance. I told him quietly but firmly that I had heard everything, every whisper, every groan, every word they should never have shared between them. I told him he didn't need to say anything else, because his silence had already said everything I needed to know. I had heard them together, had heard my name mentioned in their whispered conversations, had heard them planning things that no wife should ever have to hear. The weight of irrefutable truth finally forced Julian to drop his shoulders in defeat, close his eyes, and admit what we all already knew. He confessed in a low voice, as if he no longer had the strength or the will to keep up his charade of innocence. But he didn't say he was sorry for what he had done. He didn't explain why he had chosen to betray me on the most important night of our lives. He just said that he had been confused for a while, as if that pathetic excuse could somehow justify destroying our marriage before it had even truly begun. Laura burst into tears the moment she heard his confession, finally looking up from the floor to cover her face with her hands. She began to repeat over and over that she was sorry, that she hadn't wanted to hurt me, that she didn't know how things had gotten to this point. She cried and apologized and tried to make me believe that this had been some kind of accident, some terrible mistake that had just happened without any planning or intention, but her tears didn't move me at all. They seemed fake and calculated, too little and far too late. For years she had been the person I trusted most in the world, and she had stabbed me in the back without a moment's hesitation, without any regard for our friendship or my feelings. She was no longer my friend. She wasn't even a stranger. She was something worse than an enemy face. She was a traitor who had hidden behind the mask of friendship while planning to destroy me from within, and standing there in front of me, crying her crocodile tears and begging for forgiveness she would never receive. She was nothing more than an empty shell of a person who had sold her soul for a few moments of forbidden pleasure with my husband. I felt something inside me break into a million pieces that night, something that had no shape or name, but that held everything I was and everything I believed about human nature. My legs were shaking so hard I could barely stand. My chest was burning with a pain I had never experienced before, and I could barely breathe, as if the air itself was betraying me just like they had. But I didn't cry anymore. There were no tears left in me, only a mute, dry rage that consumed me from within and changed me in ways I wouldn't understand for months to come. My wedding had turned into the worst nightmare imaginable, and I was no longer the same person who had walked down that aisle just hours before. The innocent, trusting woman who had believed in fairy tale endings was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, colder, and infinitely more determined to never let anyone hurt her that way again. I didn't say anything else to either of them that night. There were no words in any language that could adequately express the depth of my pain, my anger, my disappointment, and my disgust. I went back to what was supposed to be our bridal suite, gathered my few personal belongings without looking at anyone or anything, and walked down the stairs in my wedding dress. My bare feet silent on the cold marble steps. My face was burning with humiliation, and my soul was in pieces, but my dignity remained intact. No one followed me as I left. I walked across the garden, where we had been married just hours before, now barefoot and carrying my shoes, ignoring the cold of the early morning air and the dew that was beginning to cover the ground. The white rose petals from our ceremony were still scattered along the pathway, but they looked wilted now, brown around the edges, as if even the flowers knew that the love story they had witnessed was nothing but a lie. I just wanted to get away, to disappear, to breathe air that didn't smell like betrayal and broken promises. And so I left without a goodbye, without an explanation to anyone else who might wonder where the bride had gone, with a heart that felt like it had been shattered with a hammer, but with my dignity still intact. I would rebuild myself from the ground up, and when I returned to face them again, it would be on my own terms, as a woman who could not be broken, could not be discarded, and could not be underestimated ever again. That night marked the end of one version of my life, and the beginning of another. I walked away from that estate a broken woman, but I would return to the world 3 years later, as someone completely transformed, face someone who had learned that the most powerful revenge is not revenge at all, but rather the quiet satisfaction of building a life so successful and fulfilling that your betrayers become irrelevant footnotes in your story of triumph. The 3 years that followed my wedding night betrayal were the most challenging and transformative years of my entire life. I spent the first 6 months in a fog of depression and self-doubt, staying with my sister in her small apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, replaying that horrible night over and over again in my mind until I thought I might lose my sanity. I questioned everything about myself, my judgment, my worth, my ability to ever trust anyone again. I wondered if there had been signs I had missed, red flags I had ignored, ways I could have prevented the destruction of my life. But slowly, with the help of a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, I began to understand that what happened to me was not my fault. Julian and Laura had made choices that had nothing to do with my worth as a person and everything to do with their own moral failures. The betrayal said nothing about me and everything about them. I threw myself into work with an intensity that surprised even me. I had always been good with numbers and had studied business in college, but I had never pushed myself to achieve anything extraordinary. Now, fueled by a combination of heartbreak, rage, and determination to prove that I didn't need anyone to validate my worth, I started my own consulting firm specializing in helping small businesses optimize their operations and increase their profitability. I worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, learning everything I could about business strategy, marketing, financial planning, and leadership. I read every book, attended every seminar, networked with every successful entrepreneur I could find. I invested every penny I had saved into building my company, and when that wasn't enough, I took calculated risks that would have terrified the old version of myself. Within 18 months, my little consulting firm had grown into something much larger. I had hired a team of talented professionals, secured contracts with major corporations, and developed a reputation as someone who could solve problems that other consultants couldn't handle. The local business magazine featured me on their cover with the headline, "The Phoenix Rising: How One Woman Built an Empire from Ashes." But my success wasn't just professional. I had also undergone a complete personal transformation. I cut my long soft hair into a sharp sophisticated bob that framed my face with authority. I replaced my wardrobe of feminine dresses and flowing fabrics with tailored suits, structured blazers, and clothes that projected power and confidence. I learned to speak with authority, to command rooms full of executives, to negotiate deals that left my opponents wondering what had just happened. More importantly, I learned to trust my own instincts again. I developed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to detect lies and hidden agendas, to protect myself from anyone who might try to take advantage of my kindness or generosity. The innocent, trusting woman who had been destroyed on her wedding night had been replaced by someone far more formidable. By the end of my second year in business, I had enough capital saved to make the move I had been planning since the day I left that estate in Virginia. I discovered that Julian's construction company, which had seemed so successful and stable during our relationship, was actually struggling financially. He had been living beyond his means, taking on projects he couldn't afford to complete, making promises to clients he couldn't keep. Through a series of carefully orchestrated investments and acquisitions, using shell companies and intermediaries, so that my involvement remained hidden, I began to systematically acquire the debts and contracts that Julian's company owed to others. Within 6 months, I owned his mortgage, his equipment leases, his outstanding loans, and most of his major client contracts. Julian had no idea what was happening. As far as he knew, his financial troubles were just bad luck, market forces beyond his control, the normal struggles that small businesses face. He had no clue that every foreclosure notice, every demand letter, every canceled contract was part of a larger plan orchestrated by the woman he had betrayed and abandoned. When I was finally ready to reveal myself, I did it in the most poetic way I could imagine. I purchased the building that housed Julian's offices, and then, as his new landlord, I gave him 30 days' notice to vacate the premises for renovations. When he came to plead with the building's new owner for more time, he found himself sitting across from me in the conference room of my own company. The look on his face when he realized who had been systematically dismantling his business empire was worth every sleepless night, every 18-hour workday, every sacrifice I had made to get to that moment. He looked older, more tired, defeated in ways that had nothing to do with his current financial troubles, and everything to do with the choices he had made 3 years earlier. "Hello, Julian," I said calmly, not standing up from behind my mahogany desk, not offering him a handshake or any gesture of civility. "I understand you are having some business difficulties." He stared at me in shock, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to form words. The confident, arrogant man who had destroyed my wedding night was gone, replaced by someone who looked desperate and afraid. He finally managed to whisper, "You did this. I built this." I corrected him, gesturing to the elegant office that surrounded us, the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city, the awards and recognition certificates that lined the walls. "You, on the other hand, destroyed what you had through poor decisions and moral bankruptcy." I learned later that Laura had fared no better in the years since our wedding night. Julian had left her within 6 months of our divorce, moving on to another woman who was younger, more naive, and more easily manipulated. Laura had lost most of her friends when the story of what she had done spread through our social circle, and she had never been able to rebuild her reputation or her relationships. She was working at a series of dead-end jobs, living alone, dealing with the consequences of trading a lifelong friendship for a man who had discarded her as easily as he had discarded me. But I didn't waste much energy thinking about Laura or gloating over her downfall. She had made herself irrelevant to my life the moment she chose Julian over our friendship, and I had more important things to focus on than the fate of someone who had proven herself to be weak, disloyal, and ultimately disposable. Julian, however, was a different story, not because I was still emotionally invested in him, but because his betrayal had taught me an important lesson about the kind of person I never wanted to be vulnerable to again. Seeing him across from me in that conference room, desperate and defeated, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction, not the hot satisfaction of revenge, but the cool satisfaction of justice served by my own hands. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing," I replied honestly. "You have nothing I want and nothing I need. I just wanted you to understand that actions have consequences, and that the woman you thought you could discard and forget has become someone far more powerful than you ever imagined." I offered him a choice. He could accept a position as a maintenance worker in the building I now owned, the same building where his company had once operated from the penthouse suite. He would be responsible for cleaning the offices, maintaining the equipment, and performing the kinds of manual labor that he had once been too proud to acknowledge even existed. Or he could leave the city entirely and try to rebuild his life somewhere else, with the understanding that I had contacts throughout the industry who would make it very difficult for him to find work in his chosen field. He chose to stay and take the maintenance position. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps he simply had nowhere else to go. But every day for the next year, as I arrived at my office in my tailored suits and Italian leather heels, I would see Julian in his maintenance uniform, emptying trash cans and mopping floors in the lobby of the building where he had once thought he was king. I never spoke to him during those encounters. I didn't gloat or make snide comments or try to humiliate him further. The situation spoke for itself more eloquently than any words could have. He had had everything: a loving wife, a successful business, a bright future, and he had thrown it all away for a few moments of selfish pleasure with a woman who had meant nothing to him. At the end of that year, Julian quietly left the city without telling anyone where he was going. I heard rumors that he had moved to another state, taken a job as a manual laborer, and was trying to rebuild his life from scratch. I wished him no particular ill will in that endeavor, but I also felt no sympathy for the difficulties he would face. As for me, my business continued to grow and thrive. I expanded into new markets, developed innovative strategies that revolutionized how companies approached operational efficiency, and built a reputation as one of the most successful and respected entrepreneurs in the region. I was featured in national magazines, invited to speak at prestigious conferences, and recognized with awards that honored my contributions to the business community. But more importantly, I had learned to find happiness and fulfillment that didn't depend on anyone else. I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed, developed skills I had never imagined I could master, and created a life that was entirely my own design. I traveled to places I had only dreamed of visiting, purchased a beautiful home that reflected my own taste and style, and surrounded myself with people who valued me for my intelligence, my accomplishments, and my character. Eventually, I did open my heart to love again. I met David at a business conference where we were both giving presentations on leadership and innovation. He was intelligent, successful in his own right, and more importantly, he was someone who had also learned hard lessons about trust and relationships. Our romance developed slowly, built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine compatibility rather than passionate infatuation. When David proposed, it wasn't with grand gestures or public displays. It was during a quiet dinner at home, after we had spent 2 years getting to know each other deeply, and honestly. He asked me to marry him not because he needed me to complete him, but because he wanted to build a life partnership with someone he genuinely admired and respected. Our wedding was small, intimate, and genuine. We exchanged vows that we had written ourselves, in front of a carefully chosen group of friends and family members who had proven their loyalty and support over many years. There were no elaborate decorations or expensive photographers, no attempts to create a fairy tale fantasy. Instead, there was honesty, commitment, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and what you want from life. As I stood there with David, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring, I thought briefly about the woman I had been on my first wedding day, naive, trusting, dependent on others for my happiness and self-worth. That woman was gone forever. But I didn't mourn her loss. She had been replaced by someone far stronger, wiser, and more capable of building the kind of love that actually lasts. Julian and Laura had intended to destroy me that night 3 years ago, but they had actually done me the greatest favor of my life. They had forced me to discover who I really was beneath the surface, what I was actually capable of when pushed to my limits, and what kind of life I could build when I stopped waiting for someone else to give it to me. Today, as I write this story from the study of the home David and I share, looking out at the garden we planted together and listening to the sound of our children playing in the yard, I can honestly say that I am grateful for every terrible moment of that wedding night, not because I enjoyed the pain, but because it taught me that I am strong enough to survive anything, smart enough to rebuild from any destruction, and worthy of love that is real, honest, and reciprocal. The betrayal that was supposed to end my story actually became the beginning of the best chapter of my life, and that perhaps is the most satisfying victory of all.